A wounded German Shepherd puppy lay half-frozen inside an abandoned Vermont factory, a broken chain still hanging from his neck. 76-year-old retired Navy SEAL Thayer Wescott found him before a snowstorm and carried the dying puppy home inside his coat. After weeks of recovery, the dog began reacting strangely whenever they passed the road leading back to that factory. When Thayer finally returned with him, the puppy ignored the place where he had suffered and went straight to an old inspection room. There, Thayer found a hidden steel box filled with valuable antiques, photographs, and records. But the dog showed no interest in any of it, because he had never gone back for treasure. He was searching for someone who had disappeared, and the truth would uncover what really happened at Hollis Copper Works. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and please like this video and subscribe for more stories of loyalty and second chances. Winter had a way of making Wren Hollow look wealthier than it was. Fresh snow hid the patched roofs and tired fences. It softened the abandoned barns, covered the rust along truck beds, and turned the narrow Vermont roads into pale ribbons beneath a clear blue-white sky. Chimney smoke rose straight on windless mornings, and when sunlight reached the valley, every frozen field glittered as if someone had scattered ground glass across it. Thayer Wescott liked those mornings, not because they were beautiful, because snow made people throw things away. At 76, Thayer still stood close to 6'1", with broad shoulders and the heavy, disciplined build of a man whose body had never entirely forgotten military training. Age had slowed him without diminishing him. His movements were economical now rather than quick, deliberate rather than forceful. A full gray-silver beard, carefully trimmed along the jaw, framed a long, weathered face. His cheekbones were pronounced beneath sun-darkened skin, and years had carved deep lines around warm hazel-green eyes. Thick gray hair, still streaked faintly with ash-brown, fell in loose waves and was usually swept back with one impatient hand. That morning he wore the same faded olive field jacket he wore through most of winter, its cloth softened by years of weather. A small U.S. veteran patch rested above one chest pocket, and an American flag, faded nearly as much as the jacket itself, was sewn onto one sleeve. Thayer never mentioned either patch. He did not need anyone reminded of what he had been. His present life was quieter. He drove an aging dark green pickup around Wren Hollow collecting things other people no longer wanted. A clock that had stopped at 4:12 sometime during the Reagan administration. A brass kerosene lamp missing its handle. 3 wooden molding planes from a barn whose new owner thought they were strange blocks of wood. And from Mrs. Dwyer's house on Alder Street, a music box that no longer played. Mrs. Dwyer watched from her doorway while Thayer turned the little walnut box over in his hands. "My daughter says I should just throw it away." "Your daughter's wrong. She's a lawyer." "That explains it." Mrs. Dwyer laughed hard enough to pull her cardigan tighter around herself. Thayer carried the box to his truck. He liked objects because objects rarely lied about what was wrong with them. A broken hinge admitted it was broken. Rust made no argument for itself. A gear missing 3 teeth did not tell you that you were imagining things. People were more inventive. Around noon, Thayer stopped at Bellamy's Cup and Curio, the odd little business June Bellamy had created by combining a cafe with a vintage shop because, as she once explained, people make worse financial decisions when holding cinnamon rolls. June was 66, lively-eyed and round-faced, with strawberry blonde hair now threaded heavily with silver and cut in a bob that swung against her jaw when she moved quickly. A red pencil was tucked behind her right ear as usual. She saw the contents of Thayer's crate and frowned. "That lamp is dead." "Temporarily." "That clock is dead." "Probably." "And whatever that is, music box. Looks like it drowned during the Coolidge administration." Thayer set the crate beside her counter. "Then it has a story." June poured him coffee without asking. "You know, normal retired people collect stamps." "I tried." "And?" "They don't need fixing." June gave him a long look over the steam from his mug. That was one of the reasons Thayer tolerated her. She knew when not to ask the second question. On his way out, he slipped a hand into the inside pocket of his jacket and touched the old steel pocket watch he carried there. It belonged to Everett Sloan. The watch had not run properly in years. Thayer could have repaired it. That was the problem. Everett had been his closest friend long after both men stopped wearing uniforms. He had also been one of those men who came home from war only to discover that the country had no map for where they were supposed to go afterward. Near the end, Everett called often. Thayer had been busy, or tired, or not in the mood to hear that particular kind of sadness. He kept thinking he would call tomorrow. Then one morning there was no tomorrow left to call into. The pocket watch remained unrepaired. Thayer had never decided whether that was punishment or memorial. His phone rang while he was loading the last crate. Calvin Roebuck's name appeared on the screen. Calvin ran Wren Hollow Public Works and had spent 4 decades knowing which roof leaked, which culvert froze first, and which town-owned building would collapse if someone sneezed near the wrong beam. "Tell me you're sitting down," Calvin said. "I'm leaning." "Close enough. We're finally doing the preliminary salvage survey at Hollis Copper." Thayer glanced north, though the old factory was miles away. Hollis Copper Works had once been the heart of Wren Hollow. For generations it produced brass fittings, copper hardware, measuring instruments, and precision components that ended up everywhere from farm machinery to naval equipment. Then contracts vanished. Production moved. The gates closed. 30 years later, older residents still referred to neighborhoods by which shift their fathers had worked. Calvin continued. "The auxiliary inspection building gets marked Monday. We already cleared the city discard items. Couple metal cabinets, lamps, old benches. Your salvage authorization covers them if you want to look before the contractors get there." "Today?" "Preferably before tonight's storm." Thayer glanced at the sky. Bright, calm, suspiciously innocent. "The forecast says light snow." "The forecast also said my second marriage would last." "You married a weather forecaster?" "Should have. Might have gotten one thing right." Thayer almost smiled. By 3:30 he was driving toward Hollis Copper Works. The weather changed before he reached it. Clouds rolled down over the hills, swallowing the afternoon sun. Snow began as fine, dry grains ticking against the windshield, then thickened until the forest beyond the road blurred white. The factory emerged slowly from the storm. Brick buildings, broken windows, a tall smokestack no longer smoking. Snow lay along rusting rails where freight carts once moved copper across the yard. Thayer parked beside the auxiliary building, checked the city tag Calvin had described, then went inside. The air smelled of cold iron, wet wood, and decades of dust. His boots disturbed powdery snow that had blown through broken panes. He found 2 salvageable lamps, an old vise too heavy to bother with, and a steel cabinet whose bottom had rusted almost entirely away. He was examining an enamel inspection sign when he heard it. Scratch. Thayer stopped. Nothing. He continued turning the sign. Scratch. Not overhead. Low. He set the sign down. The sound came again from deeper inside the room. It was so faint that another man might have dismissed it as a branch-tapping siding. Thayer did not. He stood perfectly still. There. A small scrape. Then silence. He followed it behind an overturned metal table. For several seconds he thought he was looking at a heap of dirty insulation. Then one oversized ear moved. Thayer crouched. A German shepherd puppy lay wedged beneath the table, perhaps 5 months old, though starvation had made age difficult to judge. Its coat should have been handsome. Wheat gold along the legs and chest, charcoal black across the back. Instead it was filthy and clumped. A short length of chain still hung from its collar. The left hind leg was swollen. A wound along the right shoulder had dried dark through the fur. Beside the dog sat an empty metal bowl. No water, no food. Thayer's expression changed almost imperceptibly. He had seen suffering in forms men spent entire lifetimes trying not to remember. But suffering in an animal had a particular ugliness. Animals did not invent reasons for what happened to them. They simply endured the consequences. The puppy opened its eyes, dark amber brown, alert despite everything. Thayer slowly extended one gloved hand. The puppy pulled its lips back. A growl came out, or tried to. It was barely more than air. "Fair enough," Thayer murmured. The dog attempted to move away and failed. Its head dropped back onto the concrete. Thayer looked toward the broken doorway. Snow was falling harder. He could call animal control. He could call Calvin. He could wait. All reasonable choices. His hand went unconsciously to the pocket where Everett's broken watch rested. For 1 second he heard an old voice he had successfully avoided hearing for years. "Call me when you get a chance." "Tomorrow, Everett. Tomorrow." Thayer closed his eyes briefly. Then he removed his gloves. "All right." He reached carefully toward the puppy again. This time the dog snapped. Its teeth caught nothing. Thayer did not pull away. "Easy, little soldier." The puppy's ears flattened. Thayer spoke more softly. "You don't have to prove anything to me." He unzipped his field jacket. Cold immediately found the charcoal Henley beneath. Then he worked one arm beneath the dog's chest and another beneath its hips, careful of the injured leg. The puppy made one weak sound and tried to twist away. Thayer waited, did not tighten his hold, did not force it. Eventually the small body stopped fighting because there was simply no strength left. Thayer wrapped the old olive jacket around it. The faded flag disappeared beneath dirty fur. He lifted the puppy. It weighed far less than it should have. That frightened him more than the wounds. Outside, snowfall had begun erasing his earlier footprints. Thayer crossed the factory yard slowly, carrying the dog against his chest. Halfway to the truck, its head shifted beneath the jacket. A cold nose touched the base of his throat, for only a second. Then the puppy went still again. Thayer stopped walking. Something old and unwelcome moved beneath his ribs. Not fear, not exactly. Responsibility. He had built a very good life around avoiding that particular feeling. He continued toward the truck. By the time he opened the passenger door, snow had covered the shoulders of his shirt and melted into his silver hair. Thayer placed the puppy carefully across the seat. The dog did not open its eyes. He stood there looking at it. For years, everything Thayer brought home had one thing in common. None of it needed him immediately. A clock could wait until morning. A lamp could wait a month. A music box could sit untouched for 10 years and never know the difference. This could not. Thayer shut the passenger door, walked around the truck, and climbed behind the wheel. He started the engine. For the first time in longer than he wanted to calculate, he was no longer deciding what to do with something that had been abandoned. He was deciding whether he would show up before it was too late. The truck turned away from Hollis Copper Works and disappeared into the falling snow. By the time Thayer reached Prescott Veterinary Clinic, the storm had erased most of Wren Hollow. Street signs floated out of the white only when the truck was almost beside them. The heater ran at full blast, but the puppy on the passenger seat remained frighteningly still beneath Thayer's olive field jacket. Twice, Thayer reached across at red lights and touched 2 fingers lightly against the exposed fur near its chest. Breathing. Still breathing. He refused to examine why that mattered so much already. The veterinary clinic sat at the edge of town in a low, cedar-sided building with a blue metal roof. A yellow porch light burned above the entrance. Thayer carried the puppy inside. Dr. Nell Prescott took one look at him and abandoned the paperwork in her hand. She was 61, broad-shouldered and compact, with a square, freckled face and short salt and pepper hair that looked as though she had cut it for the practical purpose of never thinking about it again. Sage green scrubs showed beneath a Navy clinic jacket. A black stethoscope hung around her neck, one section of tubing repaired with white tape. What happened? Found him at Hollis. Nell's eyes dropped to the chain hanging from the puppy's collar. Her expression changed, not dramatically. That was one thing Thayer liked about her. Nell rarely performed emotions she could put to work. Exam room, now. The next 40 minutes gave the suffering names: severe hypothermia, dehydration, malnutrition, soft tissue damage to the left hind leg, an infected wound along the right shoulder, pressure marks and hair loss beneath the collar that suggested the animal had spent too much time restrained. Nell worked while speaking in the calm, economical voice of someone who understood that panic was useless around injured animals. "He's young," she said. 5 months, maybe a little more. Hard to be precise when they're this underweight. Thayer stood against the wall with his arms folded. "Will he keep the leg?" Nell glanced at him. "That's your first question?" "It's the one I asked?" "Yes, probably. I don't feel a fracture. We'll image it when he's stable enough to handle more stress." "Probably." Thayer had spent enough of his life around doctors to know how much territory that word covered. Nell clipped fur away from the shoulder wound and cleaned it carefully. The puppy woke enough to bare its teeth. Nell stopped. Good. Thayer frowned. He's trying to bite you. Exactly. Means he still has opinions. The puppy's head fell back onto the folded towel. Nell looked at Thayer over the examination table. This didn't happen today. I know. No, I mean most of it didn't. The cold nearly finished the job, but somebody or something had him confined long enough for those collar marks to develop. The weight loss took time. Can you tell what hurt him? I can tell you what happened to the body. Nell rinsed blood from her gloved fingers. I can't tell you who did it. Thayer nodded. That answer pleased him more than certainty would have. What's his name? He doesn't have one. Nell paused. That a temporary condition or a long-term policy? Thayer gave her a flat look. I'm not keeping him. Didn't ask. When he's healthy, someone qualified can place him. Mm-hmm. Thayer disliked that sound. What? Nothing. You made a sound. I'm 61, Thayer. I make several. He almost told her that was not what he meant. Then the puppy shivered violently despite the warmed blankets, and the conversation ended. Nell kept him overnight. Thayer went home alone. The house felt exactly as it had felt the night before, which was the problem. For years, silence had been something he maintained. That night it felt like something missing. The puppy survived until morning, then the next. On the third day, Nell called and said he was stable enough to leave the clinic, provided Thayer followed a list of instructions long enough to qualify as light reading. I thought you said he'd go to a rescue. He will. When? When he's stronger. Nell looked toward the kennel where the puppy lay watching them. Good. Just wanted to make sure we were both participating in the same fiction. Thayer took the medication and left. The first week at home was less like owning a dog than negotiating with a small wounded nation. The puppy trusted walls more than people. He slept with his body angled toward the kitchen doorway. If Thayer entered too quickly, the dog's ears flattened. If Thayer reached down from above, he recoiled. Food presented another problem. The puppy ate fast, then carried pieces away and pushed them beneath blankets, behind chair legs, once inside one of Thayer's winter boots. Thayer found a chunk of boiled chicken there while dressing. He stared at the dog. The dog stared back. If I put my foot into poultry again, our arrangement changes. One ear moved. That was all. Thayer began sitting on the floor during meals. Not close, just present. He repaired clocks at the kitchen table while the puppy ate. Sometimes he read invoices aloud because silence seemed to make the dog more alert. At night, Thayer placed a padded bed beside the stove. The puppy ignored it. One morning before dawn, Thayer woke in his chair and found the dog stretched on the floor less than 3 feet away, still facing the door, still ready to move, but closer. Thayer did not reach for him. He simply went back to sleep. A few days later, he dragged a small metal chain across the workshop floor while sorting salvaged hardware. The reaction was immediate. The puppy dropped flat, not crouched, flat. His eyes widened. Breath stopped. The whole body seemed to disappear inward. Thayer froze. He looked at the chain in his hand, then at the dog. Without a word, he carried every loose chain, hook, and metal restraint out of the workshop and locked them in the shed. After that, he used a wide cloth lead when Nell instructed him to begin very short assisted walks. He never explained the change. The dog never needed him to. By the second week, appetite returned. By the third, the injured hind leg began touching the floor for brief moments. By the fourth, Nell allowed 5-minute walks on level ground. 5, she said. I can count. I've seen you define 5 minutes. That was different. You were 40. I was efficient. You were stupid. Thayer looked at the puppy sitting awkwardly beside him. See what I deal with? The dog glanced toward Nell. Nell smiled. There. He agrees with me. Something shifted during those weeks. Not dramatically. That would have made Thayer suspicious. It happened in increments so small he did not recognize the result until it already existed. He began returning from errands earlier. He stopped eating dinner over the sink because the puppy had learned to settle beneath the kitchen table. He repaired an old wooden stool and shortened the legs so the food bowl could sit slightly higher, easing pressure on the healing hind leg. One afternoon, while rebuilding a clock escapement, Thayer caught himself explaining the mechanism. "This wheel releases one tooth at a time. Too fast, the clock runs ahead. Too slow, it loses time." The puppy lay beneath the bench, chewing the corner of a rag. Thayer noticed what he was doing. He stopped. The house became quiet. The puppy lifted its head. After several seconds, Thayer continued, "Anyway, this one's running slow." The puppy went back to the rag. That was the moment, though Thayer would never have admitted it, when the arrangement stopped feeling temporary. A week later, June Bellamy arrived carrying a casserole Thayer had not requested. She found him standing in the snow beside a thicket of blackberry canes near the porch. The puppy had crawled beneath the thorny branches and was sitting there with the stubborn satisfaction of someone who had successfully occupied foreign territory. "Come out of the brambles." No movement. "You're going to tear your shoulder open again." The puppy blinked. June came around the corner carrying the casserole dish. She surveyed the scene. "You losing an argument?" "No." "Looks convincing from here." Thayer crouched. "Come on, out of the bramble." June tilted her head. "Bramble." Thayer looked at her. "What?" "That sounds like his name." "He doesn't need one." June looked toward the puppy, then back at Thayer. "I think you're several weeks late for that argument." The dog finally crawled out and shook snow over Thayer's boots. June smiled. "Definitely Bramble." "No." 3 hours later, Thayer was in the workshop when he heard fabric ripping behind him. He turned. The puppy had stolen one of his shop towels. "Bramble." The word left his mouth before he knew it was coming. The dog froze. Thayer froze too. For several seconds neither moved. Then Bramble dropped the towel and sat. Thayer stared at him. Well, the name stayed. By the 6th week, Bramble had gained weight. The charcoal saddle across his wheat-gold coat had begun to look less dull, and although the left hind leg still showed a slight limp after longer walks, Nell was satisfied with the progress. Thayer started taking him on short drives. Not because Bramble needed them, he told himself, because leaving him alone too long made him restless. One bright morning, with snowbanks gleaming under cold sunlight, Thayer drove toward the center of Wren Hollow. Bramble sat on a folded blanket in the passenger seat. They approached the northern junction. Thayer turned south. Bramble rose, his ears lifted. He looked sharply through the side window toward the road leading to Hollis Copper Works. A thin whine escaped him. Thayer kept driving. Bramble turned and watched behind them until the road disappeared. The following day, the same thing happened. Not fear. Thayer knew fear now. He had watched Bramble flatten at the sound of metal, watched him retreat from raised hands. This was different. Interest. Urgency, perhaps. The third time, Bramble placed one front paw against the passenger door and stared toward the northern road. Thayer drove another 100 yards, then pulled over. The engine idled. Bramble looked at him. Thayer looked back. For most of his life, Thayer had learned that people returned to terrible places for complicated reasons. Sometimes because they could not escape them. Sometimes because they had forgotten how to live anywhere else. And sometimes because something unfinished was still waiting there. He rested one hand on the steering wheel. All right. Bramble's ears moved forward. Thayer checked the empty road behind them, then turned the truck around. Thayer did not turn onto the road to Hollis Copper Works immediately. He pulled into the parking lot of an old feed store instead, shut off the engine, and sat for a moment with both hands resting on the steering wheel. Bramble remained upright on the passenger seat. His body was alert, but not rigid. The ears were forward. His nose worked against the thin draft leaking around the old truck door. Thayer watched him. 6 weeks ago, the dog had flattened himself at the sound of chain dragging across a concrete floor. This was not that. Still, wanting to return somewhere did not mean returning was wise. Thayer took out his phone. Calvin answered on the 4th ring. "If this is about the steel cabinet, I already told you the bottom's rotten." "It's not." That sounded serious. "I'm thinking about taking the dog back to Hollis." There was a short silence. Calvin's voice changed. "You sure?" "No." "Good answer." Thayer looked at Bramble. "He reacts every time we pass the north road. Could be smell. Could be. Could be nothing. Could be. Calvin sighed. You've still got access to the auxiliary section. Stay inside the marked zone. East wing is taped off because the roof trusses are bad. Don't argue with yellow tape just because you used to jump out of airplanes. I never argued with tape. You've argued with everything else. Calvin gave him the combination to the exterior gate again and told him to call if anything looked structurally wrong. Thayer ended the call. Then he called Nell. She was less cooperative. You want to take a recovering dog back to the place where you found him half frozen and chained? When you say it like that, it sounds unwise. It is unwise. He keeps reacting to the road. That doesn't mean he's asking for a field trip. Thayer looked across the seat. Bramble had lowered himself but was still staring toward the north road. What would make it less stupid? Nell took a breath. Short visit. Daylight only. Cloth lead. No forcing him through doors. If he freezes, pants hard, tries to flee, shuts down, or refuses movement, you leave. I know. I'm saying it because men your age hear instructions as personal criticism. My age? Yes, 76. Good memory. I'm a doctor. For animals. Today I'm making an exception. That earned the smallest smile from him. 20 minutes later, the green pickup rolled through the gates of Hollis Copper Works. The morning was bright after 2 days of snowfall. Sunlight bounced off the drifts piled against the old brick walls, giving the abandoned factory an almost clean appearance from a distance. Up close, winter could not hide everything. Mortar had fallen from the brickwork. Window frames bowed inward. Rust streaked the exterior walls beneath broken gutters. The old smokestack rose above the buildings like a monument nobody had agreed to maintain. Thayer parked near the auxiliary inspection building. He opened his door first. Bramble did not move. Thayer came around to the passenger side and opened that door too. Cold air entered the cab. Bramble leaned forward and sniffed. Thayer clipped the wide cloth lead to his brown leather collar. He did not pull. Your choice. For several seconds nothing happened. Then Bramble climbed down. The left hind leg touched the snow carefully. He stood still. His nose lifted. Once. Twice. Then he began walking. Not toward the room where Thayer had found him. That surprised Thayer. Bramble followed the outside wall first, pausing beside a drain pipe, then at a broken loading door. He sniffed the lower frame of a window and moved on. Thayer gave him the full length of the lead. There was no urgency in the dog, no cinematic certainty. He wandered in short, uneven lines, following scent where scent still existed and abandoning it where winter had erased too much. Inside the auxiliary building, light fell through broken panes in long white bars. Bramble slowed. His nails clicked softly over the concrete. Thayer noticed the sound changed near the old sorting room where he had found him. The dog noticed more. 20 feet from the doorway, Bramble stopped. His ears lowered. His mouth closed. One front paw lifted slightly from the ground. Thayer immediately stopped too. The room waited ahead of them. The overturned table was still there. The empty metal bowl remained near the wall, untouched since Calvin's crew had flagged the area for documentation. Bramble took one small step backward. Thayer loosened the lead. That's enough. He turned his body toward the exit. No disappointment, no command, no attempt to make the dog prove anything. They had nearly reached the outer corridor when Bramble stopped again. This time he looked left. There was a narrow passage Thayer had barely noticed during his first visit. It led away from the holding room toward the older inspection wing. Bramble sniffed the air, then walked into it. Thayer followed. The corridor was colder. Old conduit ran along one wall. A row of faded safety signs hung crooked above warped wooden doors. One still read, "Eye protection required," though no one had needed eye protection there in 30 years. Bramble paused at the first doorway. Nothing. Second. Nothing. At the third, his pace changed. Not faster. More certain. He entered a room dominated by a heavy steel inspection table bolted to the floor. A cracked chair lay on its side nearby. Rusting gauges still clung to the far wall. Bramble circled the chair, sniffed its legs, moved behind it, then returned to the same place. He lowered himself beside the chair and lay down. Thayer waited. Bramble did not scratch, did not bark, did not look toward some hidden corner. He simply rested his chin on his front paws. The position unsettled Thayer more than excitement would have. It looked familiar, not familiar to Thayer, familiar to the dog. He walked slowly around the room. There was dust everywhere, old filings, mouse droppings, a narrow drift of snow beneath one broken window. Nothing immediately suggested why anyone had used this room recently. Then he noticed the steel floor plate beneath the inspection table. 16 screws held it down. Most were dull orange with corrosion. 4 were not. Not clean, just different. The rust around their heads had been broken. Thayer crouched. His knees objected. He ignored them. The edge of the plate showed another inconsistency. Dust gathered thickly along 3 sides, thinly along the 4th. Something had disturbed it. Not yesterday, but not 30 years ago either. Thayer looked at Bramble. The dog's eyes were half closed. He was not watching the plate. That mattered. Thayer took out his phone. "Calvin." "What broke?" "Nothing yet." "That yet worries me. I'm in the old inspection room. There's a steel access plate under the main bench." Another pause. "Don't open it." "I haven't." That sentence just improved my morning. "Can you get here?" Calvin arrived 40 minutes later in a public works truck that looked as old as the factory. He came through the doorway carrying a rolled blueprint under one arm, his heavy dark olive work jacket dusted with snow. At 64, Calvin had the thick forearms of someone who had spent most of his adult life lifting things that paperwork said required 2 people. A navy knit cap sat low over his white hair, and a large brass keyring knocked against his belt with every step. Bramble heard the metal before Calvin entered. His head rose, the right front paw lifted. Thayer saw it. "Stop there." Calvin froze. "What?" "Keys." Calvin looked down, then understood. He unclipped the ring and set it carefully outside the room. When he entered again, Bramble remained alert, but did not retreat. Calvin glanced at the dog. "Better?" "Enough." He unrolled the old blueprint across the steel table. The paper cracked faintly at the folds. "Inspection room 12, Calvin said. "Built in 63, renovated in 78. His thick finger followed faded lines. "There." A narrow rectangle ran under the floor. "Utility chase. Pneumatic lines, instrument cable, maybe compressed air. They sealed most of these after the equipment upgrades." Thayer pointed to the plate. "Those screws were opened." Calvin crouched beside him. He ran one thumb over the disturbed rust. "Yeah." "When?" "No way to know from this." "Recently enough to leave a difference." "Recently compared to 30 years is a wide window." Thayer nodded. That was exactly the kind of answer he wanted. No guessing disguised as certainty. Calvin looked toward Bramble. "Dog bring you here?" "He brought himself here." "Same thing?" "No." Thayer glanced toward the cracked chair. "I don't think he cares about the floor." Calvin followed his gaze. Bramble had settled again beside the chair. The older man's expression softened. "Then what does he care about?" Thayer did not answer. Calvin contacted the municipal office, documented the condition of the plate, and confirmed they could inspect the utility chase because the building remained under town control and the area was not sealed as evidence or structurally restricted. They photographed everything before touching it. Then Calvin brought in a hand driver and worked the screws loose. The last one resisted. 30 years of corrosion," Calvin muttered. 4 screws say otherwise. 4 screws had ambition. Eventually the plate lifted. Cold, stale air rose from beneath it. Calvin shone a flashlight down. The chase was shallow, maybe 2 feet deep, running beneath the inspection floor. Pipes crossed through it. Dust coated everything. Then the beam stopped. Well. A steel toolbox sat between 2 old pneumatic lines. It had been wrapped in dark waxed cloth and pushed far enough under the floor that it could not be seen from the access opening without a light. Calvin looked at Thayer. "You expecting that?" "No." "That makes 2 of us." They did not immediately pull it out. Calvin photographed it in place. Only then did they lift it carefully onto the floor. The toolbox was old, but not abandoned. The hinges had been oiled. The waxed cloth had protected it from much of the damp. Thayer opened the lid. Inside lay objects arranged with deliberate care. A silver pocket watch with a yellowed paper label tied around the chain. 6 brass Hollis employee badges. a silver brooch shaped like a spray of leaves, an old ecclesiastical seal wrapped in cloth, several bundles of letters tied with cotton tape, printed photographs showing furniture, jewelry, tools, clocks, paintings, and household objects, and beneath them a black notebook. Thayer opened it. Not prose, no confession, no explanation. Pages of dates, numbers, initials, street abbreviations, vehicle plates, auction names, short marks beside certain entries. Calvin leaned over his shoulder. "You understand any of that?" "No." "Good. Was worried retirement had made you psychic." Thayer closed the notebook. The discovery should have been the most interesting thing in the room. It wasn't. He looked across the floor. Bramble had not moved. The dog had shown no interest when they opened the plate. No interest when the toolbox emerged. No interest when paper and metal scents entered the air. He remained beside the broken chair. Thayer walked over slowly. Bramble lifted his head. Thayer crouched beside him. There were scratches in the chair legs from ordinary wear. One side of the seat was slightly polished where fabric or a hand had rubbed it repeatedly. Human use. Someone had sat there often, maybe recently, maybe long ago. Thayer placed one hand against the cold metal frame. Bramble leaned his nose toward the chair leg. He breathed in, then rested his chin back on his paws. Something settled into place inside Thayer. Not an answer. A correction. He had been thinking in the wrong direction. The dog had not brought them here because something was hidden under the floor. The dog had brought them here because this room meant someone. Someone who had stood here, worked here, sat in this chair. Someone whose scent, memory, or routine remained strong enough inside Bramble that 6 weeks of pain had not erased it. Thayer looked at the toolbox again, then at the dog. For once, the object was not the thing that mattered most. The absence beside it was. Thayer did not take the toolbox home. That was Calvin's first concern, and Thayer almost took offense at the suggestion. Almost. Instead, the box remained on the inspection room floor while Calvin called the sheriff's office from his truck. By noon, the old auxiliary building at Hollis Copper Works held more people than it had seen in years. Sheriff Mason Truitt arrived without sirens. He was 58, broad through the middle and shoulders, with a weather-reddened face, dark hair graying heavily at the temples, and an old break across the bridge of his nose that had never healed quite straight. His winter sheriff's jacket was dark forest green over a tan uniform shirt, and a small black notebook sat in his chest pocket. Mason looked first at the opened floor plate, then at the toolbox, then at Bramble, who was still lying near the broken chair. "You touch anything after Calvin called?" "The lid. Before or after?" "Before." Mason nodded and wrote it down. No irritation, no accusation, just fact. Thayer found that strangely reassuring. Mason crouched beside the box without touching it. "Interesting. That's all? You want me to arrest the toolbox?" Calvin snorted. Thayer did not. Mason stood again. "I believe you found something unusual. That doesn't tell me whose property it is, whether any crime happened, or whether half of this came from somebody's grandfather cleaning out a basement. There are license plates in the notebook. License plates are legal to write down. A church seal. Churches lose things. 6 employee badges. People collect them." Thayer's jaw tightened. Mason met his eyes evenly. "I'm not dismissing you. It sounds close. I'm telling you there's a difference between something being wrong and me having enough to say what." That landed harder than Thayer expected. For much of his old life, identifying danger had been enough to change posture, move position, prepare. Civilian life demanded a different discipline. Suspicion had to survive paper. Mason photographed the contents, logged each item, and arranged for the box to be transported to the sheriff's evidence room until ownership could be clarified. He allowed Thayer to keep none of it. Thayer approved. He was beginning to understand that the most important thing about old objects was often the person who could still say, "That was ours." The first useful answer came from Audrey Linden. Audrey ran the Wren Hollow Historical Society out of 2 converted rooms above the old library, surrounded by shelves of ledgers, framed factory photographs, and cabinets labeled in handwriting no one else was allowed to improve. At 68, she was tall and narrow, with a chin-length silver bob cut so precisely it looked unaffected by weather. Tortoiseshell glasses sharpened her already angular face, and a dark teal turtleneck disappeared beneath a brown-gray tweed blazer. She examined the photographs. Mason had authorized them to show her through a small brass magnifier with an ebony handle. The brooch stopped her. "Wait." She brought the magnifier closer. "What?" "This engraving." Thayer leaned in. On the back were 2 tiny initials and a date. Audrey stood so quickly her chair rolled backward. "I know this." She crossed the room, pulled open a file drawer, and removed a folder. Inside was a photocopy of an estate inventory from 9 years earlier. "Eleanor Pike," Audrey said, "lived on Maple Run, widow, no children nearby. Her niece handled the estate." She traced a line with one finger. "Silver leaf brooch, wedding gift, listed in the family intake notes." "Was it sold?" Audrey kept reading. Her expression changed. "No." Thayer waited. "It was marked missing before final distribution." The room seemed to grow smaller. Audrey looked at the photograph again, excitement giving way to unease. That family thought a relative had taken it. The Hollis badge came next. Audrey recognized the employee number format and found the name attached to it. Clarence Mott, machine inspector, employed 1958 to 1987. His son still lived outside town. The old chapel seal took longer. Audrey disappeared into a basement archive and returned with a photograph from a church anniversary display. There, beside a pastor who had been dead 12 years, sat the same seal. The chapel had reported it missing during renovation. 3 objects, 3 separate owners, 3 separate stories of disappearance. Mason remained cautious. "Still not a case against anyone." Audrey looked offended. "No one said it was." "You looked like you were about to." "I look like this when people interrupt archival work." Thayer almost smiled. The next step was paperwork. That led Mason to Maribel Crane. She arrived at the sheriff's office carrying 2 archival storage boxes and the guarded expression of someone who had spent years hoping never to be asked the question she knew was coming. Maribel was 55, tall and spare, with olive-toned skin and black hair threaded by 2 strong streaks of silver at the temples, pulled into a low bun. Her camel wool coat was immaculate despite the slush outside. A folding metal measuring rule protruded slightly from one pocket. She sat across from Mason. Thayer stayed near the window. Bramble was at home with June. Mason placed copies of the photographs on the table. "You've seen any of these?" Maribel did not answer immediately. Her eyes moved from the brooch to the badge, then to one photograph of a carved mantel clock. "Yes." One word. "Heavy." "Where?" "In estate catalogs." "Which estates?" "Several." Mason opened his notebook. Maribel pressed her lips together. "I need to explain something first." No one interrupted. "For years I worked independent valuation. Families hired me before estate sales. I documented furniture, jewelry, tools, collectibles, anything that could reasonably matter." She folded her hands. "I kept my original catalogs." "Why?" "Because people argue later." "That happen often?" "Enough." She looked toward Thayer. "Sometimes the final sale packets didn't match what I submitted." Thayer straightened. "How?" "Descriptions changed, items removed, values reduced." Mason said, "Examples." Maribel's gaze lowered. Antique silver becomes plated servingware. A handmade clock becomes damaged household decor. A signed painting becomes decorative landscape, no resale value. And then? Sometimes those pieces were gone before the family came back. "Did you report it?" A silence followed. Maribel's face hardened, not defensively but against herself. "I asked questions." "That's not what I asked." "No." Her answer came quieter. "I didn't report it." Thayer knew that tone. Not guilt exactly. The older cousin of guilt. Shame with paperwork attached. "Why not?" Mason asked. "Because I was freelance. Because companies that handled cleanouts could stop hiring me. Because every time I questioned an invoice, someone had a reasonable explanation." She looked at the photographs again. And because it was easier to believe I was being suspicious than to believe someone was stealing from grieving families. Thayer said nothing. He did not need to. He understood the architecture of that mistake too well. There was always a reasonable reason not to act today. Then Maribel reached into the first storage box. She removed a folder marked Quill, A. Thayer noticed the name before Mason did. "Who's Quill?" Maribel looked up. "Arden Quill." She seemed surprised the name meant nothing to him. 72, metal conservator, worked Hollis years ago, then did private restoration. Thayer's attention sharpened. "Why is he in your files?" "He came to me 3 months ago." "What for?" "The same thing you're asking." Maribel opened the folder. Inside were copies of estate catalogs marked with Arden's notes. He thought objects were being diverted before sale. He had photographs, auction records, shipping dates. Not enough to prove a full pattern, but enough to make me stop pretending I hadn't seen one. Mason leaned forward. "Where is he now?" Maribel looked at him. "I thought you knew." Mason's pen stopped. "Knew what?" Arden disappeared. The room became very still. Thayer did not react outwardly, but something inside him tightened. "When?" "Nearly 2 months ago." Mason stood. "Stay here." He left the room. Thayer stared at the folder. One photograph had slipped halfway out. An older man sat outside a workshop doorway. Lean. Silver hair touching his ears. Leather apron. Round spectacles hanging on a cord around his neck. And beside his boot sat a young German shepherd. Wheat gold coat. Uneven charcoal saddle. Ears too large for his head. Thayer reached for the photograph, then stopped before touching it. Maribel noticed. "You know the dog?" He did not answer. Mason returned with a printed report. Adult missing person entry. Arden Quill, 72. Last confirmed sighting 7 weeks ago. Thayer looked again at the photograph. "Did the report mention a dog?" Mason scanned the page. "No." Maribel frowned. "He had one. Never went anywhere without him." Thayer finally picked up the photograph by its edges. "What was his name?" Maribel looked at the puppy beside Arden. "Bramble." The word entered Thayer quietly. No dramatic revelation, no sudden noise, just a name he had believed was born in a blackberry thicket behind his house. He looked down at the photograph again. Bramble already had a name, a home, a person. That evening, Thayer drove back slowly. June had left Bramble at his house after watching him for the day. The dog met Thayer at the kitchen door, tail moving hard enough to knock lightly against the cabinet. Thayer did not greet him in the usual way. He placed Arden's copied photograph on the floor. Bramble approached, stopped, sniffed. His tail began to move, not excitedly, just once, then again. The dog touched his nose to the image. Thayer felt something inside his chest sink. Bramble walked away from the photograph, straight to the front door. He sat and waited. Thayer stood behind him for a long time. The next morning, Mason obtained permission to enter Arden's house as part of the missing person follow-up after the newly discovered property connection gave them reason to revisit the case. The small white farmhouse sat 6 miles north of town. Snow had piled against the porch. No smoke rose from the chimney. Mason unlocked the door. Bramble entered behind Thayer on the cloth lead. The change in him was immediate, not panic. Recognition. He moved through the entry hall with his nose low. Kitchen, living room, a worn chair beside the window, an empty ceramic water bowl near the mudroom. Bramble sniffed each one, then moved toward the bedroom hallway. Thayer did not follow far. He did not need to. This was not a strange building to the dog. This had been home. Mason inspected locks and windows. No obvious forced entry, no overturned furniture, no blood. No cinematic evidence of a violent disappearance, only absence. That made it worse somehow. Back in the front room, Bramble settled beside the door. He faced outward, exactly as he often did at Thayer's house. But now Thayer understood the habit differently. He had thought Bramble slept facing doors because he feared what might come through them. Maybe sometimes he did. But here was another possibility. The dog was watching for someone to return. Thayer sat carefully on the edge of an old bench. Bramble remained beside the door. For weeks, Thayer had let himself believe the dog's attachment was slowly becoming his. He had fed him, carried him, learned his fears, learned the sounds that made him relax, given him a name. Except he had not given him a name. Someone else had done that first. Someone Bramble had not forgotten. Mason came back from the hallway. No sign of a struggle. Thayer nodded. Doesn't mean much. No. Mason looked at the dog. You okay? Thayer almost laughed at the question. Instead he said, He is. Mason understood enough not to correct him. Bramble's ears shifted at a passing vehicle outside. He stood. For 1 second his whole body leaned toward the sound. Then the vehicle continued down the road. Bramble sat again. Thayer looked away. He had spent most of his life collecting things other people no longer wanted. It had never occurred to him that one day he might become attached to something that had never been abandoned at all. Bramble was not waiting for a new owner. He was waiting for Arden Quill. And if Arden came home, Thayer understood exactly what that would mean. He would have to open his hands. The investigation did not break open. It accumulated. That frustrated Thayer more than he expected. For 3 days, the black notebook from the steel toolbox produced nothing dramatic. No hidden confession. No name circled in red. No sentence explaining who had stolen what or why. It contained numbers, dates, street abbreviations, vehicle plates, auction houses in Albany, Boston, Concord, and places farther west. Small marks in Arden Quill's handwriting that meant something only to Arden. Audrey Linden worked through old estate files at the Historical Society, matching addresses to family names. Maribel Crane brought in her original valuation catalogs. Sheriff Mason Truitt requested invoices, sale records, and transport documents where he legally could. Thayer mostly stayed out of their way. Mostly. On the 4th morning, he was sitting at June Bellamy's cafe with Bramble under the table when Mason walked in, carrying a folder thick enough to sour his mood. June placed coffee in front of him without asking. Mason opened the folder. We have a pattern. Thayer looked up. That sounds different from yesterday. It is different from yesterday. Mason spread several photocopies across the table. One was Maribel's original inventory for the estate of a retired schoolteacher. A walnut wall clock was listed as handmade, late 19th century, estimated value $1,200. The final liquidation report described it as damaged decorative furniture. Another document showed what appeared to be the same clock sold 5 months later through an auction house in Massachusetts for nearly $4,000. Different provenance, different seller, same repair scar across the lower case. Audrey had identified it from an old family photograph. Mason tapped another page. Same thing with 2 pieces of silver, 1 painting, 3 Hollis items, different estates, different years. And who handled the clearouts? Mason leaned back. Frost Estate and Salvage. Thayer had heard the name. Everybody in Wren Hollow had. Lucian Frost bought old houses, emptied estates, ran warehouse sales, and occasionally appeared in local newspapers talking about preservation. He donated antique maps to libraries, sponsored historical lectures, once paid to restore the town hall clock. That kind of man was harder to distrust because he understood the value of appearing useful. Lucian Frost? June asked quietly from behind the counter. Mason looked at her. You know him? Everyone knows him. He bought the Weller place after Ruth died. She wiped her hands on her indigo apron. Very polite man. Thayer looked at her. That sounded like an accusation. June shrugged. I've lived long enough to know politeness is a tool like any other. Mason almost smiled. Right now, Frost is a connection, not a suspect I can prove anything against. The distinction mattered. Thayer disliked it. He accepted it. Mason continued. Some missing objects passed through companies that did business with Frost. That does not prove Lucian personally ordered them removed. Who did the moving? Working on that. Bramble shifted beneath the table. Thayer lowered one hand without looking. The dog rested his muzzle briefly against his boot. By afternoon, Mason had another answer. A name. Deke Moreland, 43. Longtime logistics employee for Frost Estate and Salvage. Dake drove the larger clear-out trucks, supervised warehouse transfers, and handled rural properties that needed to be emptied quickly. There were complaints attached to his name, nothing major enough to make him famous. A fistfight behind a bar, a trespassing dispute. A farmer who claimed Deke struck one of his dogs with a shovel handle during a property cleanout. No charge had followed. The farmer had withdrawn the complaint. Thayer stared at that line longer than the others. Mason noticed. "Don't build the whole house from one board." "I'm not." "You are." Thayer closed the file. "Then find me more boards." Mason did. One came from a gas station 12 miles north of Wren Hollow. The station still stored security footage longer than anyone expected because the owner had upgraded the system without clearing the old archive. The night Arden disappeared, a dark Frost Estate box truck had passed through at 8:47 p.m. The rear plate matched a vehicle assigned to Deke. Direction of travel, Hollis Copper Works. Return time, 11:26 p.m. No clear image of passengers, no view of what the truck carried, but enough to matter. Mason placed the still frames on his desk. Thayer looked at them. "Can you bring him in?" "For questions." "Can you search his property?" "Not on this alone." Thayer's mouth tightened. Mason closed the folder. "There's that look again." "What look?" "The one that says the law is inconvenient." "Sometimes it is." "Good. Means it's usually stopping somebody from doing something they'll regret." Thayer thought of a younger version of himself and decided Mason had earned that point. Then the phone rang. Mason answered. His posture changed within 20 seconds. Not alarm, attention. He took a pen from his chest pocket. "Spell that county." Thayer watched. Mason wrote, "What hospital?" Another pause. Then, "He's alive?" Thayer stopped breathing for half a beat. Mason looked at him. The answer was already in his face. Arden Quill had been found. Not recently. Weeks ago. A long-haul driver had discovered an injured older man near a rural road across the state line in New Hampshire after a night of freezing rain. Arden had no wallet, no phone. His coat was torn and wet. He had suffered a concussion, 2 cracked ribs, and trauma to the right hip. He could give his first name within the first day and his full name later, but his memory of the hours immediately before the injury came back in fragments. The hospital had documented him. A local deputy had entered the information. But Arden's Wren Hollow missing person report had initially been categorized as an adult voluntary disappearance with no confirmed criminal component. The two records had never connected. Until Mason widened the search, Thayer stared at the wall. For days he had imagined 2 possibilities. Arden had abandoned Bramble, or Arden was dead. He had never allowed himself much space between them. Now there was a third possibility. The man had been trying to get back. Mason arranged a video interview that evening with Arden's rehabilitation center. Thayer was permitted to sit in, not as an investigator, but because Mason believed the discovery of Bramble might matter to Arden's recollection. Bramble stayed at Thayer's house with June. That was deliberate. Mason did not want emotion complicating the first formal account. The screen flickered. Then Arden Quill appeared. He looked older than the photograph, not simply because time had passed. Pain had rearranged him. His silver hair had grown over his ears and curled untidily around a narrow face. Small round spectacles hung from a leather cord against an oatmeal sweater. One cheek was still faintly yellow from an old bruise. He sat slightly angled in the chair, protecting the injured hip. When Mason introduced Thayer, Arden's eyes sharpened. "You found the box?" "Yes." "Where?" "Inspection room 12. Arden closed his eyes. A breath left him. Then he asked, "The dog?" Thayer leaned forward. "Alive." Arden's face changed. Not theatrically. It collapsed inward for 1 second before he regained control. "Bramble?" "He's alive." Arden pressed one hand over his mouth. Thayer looked away. Some moments belonged to the person receiving them. Mason waited. When Arden could speak again, he began slowly. He had noticed discrepancies in estate sales nearly a year earlier. Small things at first. A clock he repaired for a widow later vanished from the family's final inventory. Silver hardware from another estate appeared at auction under a different provenance. He began taking photographs, writing down truck plates, comparing sale dates. Maribel confirmed that some of her catalogs had been changed. Arden did not know how large the scheme was. He only knew somebody was moving valuable items through legitimate channels after stripping away their ownership history. "Why Hollis?" Mason asked. "My workshop was there." Arden adjusted his glasses. "I rented Inspection Room 12 from the town under the old artisan use agreement. Bramble came with me most days." Thayer glanced at Mason. That explained the chair, the room, the dog's memory. Arden continued. A shipment scheduled for one of Frost's warehouses had included an object Arden recognized from an estate that should never have released it. He copied the information and drove to Hollis that evening to compare notes. He did not know he had been followed. Deke Moreland came in through the loading side. Mason's pen stopped. "You knew him?" "I'd seen him before." "Alone?" Arden hesitated. "No." "Who else?" "Another man. I didn't see his face well enough to swear to it. No convenient identification, no miraculous certainty." Thayer appreciated the honesty. Arden's voice grew quieter. "They wanted the notebook." "You told them where it was?" "No." "Why?" "Because by then I understood they were more afraid of the records than the objects." Arden had already placed the notebook and selected items inside the utility chase. He had not brought Bramble for protection. The dog was simply there because Bramble was always there. When the men moved toward him, Arden grabbed the puppy and ran. He reached a fire door, pushed Bramble ahead through the opening, then saw another figure coming from the opposite passage. Bramble was caught before Arden could pull him back. "I went after him." Arden's voice cracked. "I need that clear." Thayer did not move. "I didn't leave him." Mason said softly, "Take your time." Arden shook his head. "No. I need him to know." The words were meant for Thayer, maybe for Bramble, maybe for himself. Arden tried to reach the dog. Deke struck him. Arden fell against a railing, then over the slope behind the auxiliary building. He remembered snow, mud, a flashlight above him, then running without knowing where he was going. His wallet and phone were gone when he woke near the road. "What happened to Bramble after that?" Mason asked. Arden looked stricken. "I don't know." Thayer did. Mason did too. The rest came from what they could now reasonably infer and what later statements would have to confirm. Deke knew Bramble had spent nearly every workday with Arden. He knew dogs could follow familiar scent. If Arden had hidden records somewhere inside Hollis, the puppy might return to the area where Arden had handled them. So Deke kept Bramble, walked him through the buildings, again. The dog searched. But not for paper, not for antiques, not for a toolbox. He searched for Arden. When Deke failed to get the result he wanted, frustration became cruelty. The wounds Nell documented now had a context. Not yet a courtroom conclusion, but a context. Eventually, whoever held Bramble decided the dog was useless. They left him chained inside the auxiliary building. The storm nearly finished what they had started. Thayer found him before it did. After the call, Thayer drove home without turning on the radio. Bramble met him at the door. The dog was stronger now, nearly handsome beneath the winter coat growing back over old wounds. He came forward, then paused, lifting one front paw slightly as he sometimes did when uncertain. Thayer lowered himself onto the bench. Bramble approached. Thayer rested a hand against the dog's neck. For weeks he had admired Bramble for refusing to lead bad men to the hidden box. That story had been comforting, almost heroic. It was also wrong. Bramble had never protected evidence. He had never understood a theft scheme. He had never made a moral choice about antiques. He had done something simpler, and perhaps harder. Every time they brought him back into that factory, he had searched for the same person. Arden. Thayer looked toward the front door. So did Bramble. This time, Thayer understood why. "He tried to come back," Thayer said. Bramble's ears moved at the sound of Arden's name when Thayer spoke it next. The dog looked at him, then toward the door again. Thayer rubbed one thumb slowly along the brown leather collar. "You were looking for the wrong thing." He paused. "No." A faint, tired smile touched his face. "We were." Bramble leaned against his knee. And for the first time, Thayer understood that loyalty did not need to know the truth. Sometimes it only needed to remember who was missing. By the second week after Arden's interview, the story had begun traveling without anyone officially telling it. That was the trouble with old objects. They belonged to networks before they belonged to collections. A restorer knew a dealer knew an auctioneer An auctioneer remembered a clock. A clock reminded someone of a catalog photographed 3 years earlier. Audrey Linden had sent images of 2 recovered pieces to an auction specialist in Boston, asking only for provenance help. The specialist recognized the style of documentation. Someone mentioned Frost Estate and salvage. From there, the rumor began moving faster than Mason Truett's warrants. Thayer learned this on a pale afternoon when a black luxury sedan rolled slowly up his snowy driveway. Bramble heard it first. He rose from his place near the stove and went to the front window. No growl, just attention. Thayer looked through the glass. The man who stepped from the car wore a midnight navy wool overcoat that looked completely inappropriate for shoveling snow and perfectly appropriate for never needing to. He was tall, narrow through the waist, with straight posture and a composed face sharpened by high cheekbones. Dark ash-brown hair, lightly silvered at the temples, was parted with expensive precision. Lucian Frost carried a leather folder beneath one arm. Even from the window, Thayer noticed the square silver signet ring on his right hand. Bramble's body remained still. Thayer touched the dog lightly between the shoulders. "Stay inside." Then he stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind him. Lucian smiled. "Mr. Wescott." "Mr. Frost." "I hope I'm not intruding." "You drove through 6 inches of snow to my house." Lucian considered that. Fair point. He did not extend his hand. Thayer appreciated the efficiency. Lucian glanced once toward the window. Bramble stood behind the glass. Recognition did not cross Lucian's face strongly enough for Thayer to use it, but his eyes stayed on the dog half a second too long. Then he opened the folder. "I understand several pieces associated with old estate clearouts have recently surfaced." "Do you?" "I work in a small industry." "So I'm learning." Lucian smiled again, but this time nothing in it warmed. "I thought it might be useful to prevent a misunderstanding before lawyers begin turning ordinary business into theater." "What misunderstanding?" "That possession and ownership are not always the same thing." Thayer leaned one shoulder against the porch post. "The items are with the sheriff." "I assumed." "Then why are you here?" "To speak with the man who found them." Lucian removed several pages from the folder. "These pieces moved through multiple estates, salvage agreements, contractor inventories. Some owners are deceased, some heirs signed broad disposal authorizations, some families cannot even identify what they believe they lost." "You seem well prepared." "I dislike confusion." Thayer looked at the documents without taking them. Lucian continued, "I'm prepared to offer a substantial settlement for any claims arising from the recovered material, enough to avoid years of dispute." "Settlement with who?" "With whoever has standing." "And if nobody does?" Lucian's expression remained patient. "Then the objects should go somewhere they will be preserved. Like your warehouses." "My company preserves things all the time." "Your company sells them." "Preservation is expensive." Thayer looked past him toward the white fields beyond the drive. Lucian followed his gaze. "Mr. Wescott, an object can sit forgotten in an attic for 50 years while a family lets moisture destroy it. Then someone with knowledge recognizes what it is, pays for restoration, places it where it will survive, and suddenly that person is called greedy." "Sometimes." "Sometimes what?" "Sometimes he is." Lucian gave a quiet laugh. "You're a collector yourself." "No." "You repair antiques." "I repair what people bring me." "You sell some." "After they give me permission." "That distinction matters to you." "It should matter to everybody." Lucian closed the folder. Most people don't know what they own. There it was. Not a confession. Something more useful. A belief. Thayer studied him. Lucian's voice softened. "A woman inherits a box of silver and leaves it under leaking shingles. A man clears his father's workshop and throws away tools made before he was born. A church stores a 19th century seal beside paper plates and Christmas decorations." He gestured toward the town below. "People are careless with history." Thayer nodded once. "They are." Lucian seemed almost pleased. "Then you understand." "No." The smile faded slightly. Thayer said, "Carelessness doesn't make something yours." Lucian looked toward the window again. Bramble had sat down, still watching. "Value goes to whoever recognizes it." Thayer shook his head. "Price does." Lucian's eyes returned to him. Thayer continued, "You're confusing price with value." For the first time, Lucian's face lost its polish, only briefly. Then the calm returned. "I came here to resolve this sensibly." "No, you came here to find out how much I know." Silence. Snow slid softly from one side of the porch roof. Lucian buttoned his coat. "You were in the military a long time, weren't you?" Thayer's expression did not change. "That relevant?" "Only in the sense that men with certain histories sometimes mistake suspicion for certainty." Thayer had been threatened more elegantly. "Not often." He opened the front door. "This conversation's over." Lucian looked at him for another moment, then nodded. "Of course." He walked back to his car without another word. Thayer watched until the sedan disappeared beyond the trees. He did not follow, did not photograph the plate, did not call Lucian back. He went inside. Bramble moved close enough that his shoulder touched Thayer's leg. Thayer stood there for several seconds, then called Mason. "I think Frost just tried to buy a problem." Mason sighed through the phone. "Did he threaten you?" "No." "Offer money?" "Carefully." "Admit anything?" "No." "Good." Thayer frowned. "Good? Means he's still afraid of saying the wrong thing." The next week belonged to people who understood paper better than Thayer did. Maribel produced original catalogs with timestamps and signatures. Audrey matched photographs of recovered items to family archives. Mason obtained records from auction houses through formal requests. A forensic accountant from the state attorney's office followed payments through 2 limited liability companies that shared addresses, directors, and bank transfers with Frost Estate. One company had no employees, the other had no physical office. Both had received proceeds from sales of objects whose original estate inventories described them as damaged, discarded, or valueless. Still, Mason did not move early. He waited until the pieces connected. That patience irritated Thayer. Then it impressed him. The search warrant for Deke Moreland's storage property was signed on a Tuesday morning. Mason did not invite Thayer. Thayer did not ask. By evening, Mason came to the house. He removed his hat before entering. That told Thayer the news mattered. They found property. How much? Enough. In Deke's warehouse were furniture, silver, framed paintings, tools, clocks, Hollis memorabilia, and sealed estate cartons that had never reached final distribution. Some still had family labels attached. In a back section behind shelving, deputies found a rough kennel built from chain-link panels, an old water bucket, several lengths of chain, blankets embedded with yellow-black dog hair. Nell Prescott later examined photographs and collected records from Bramble's treatment. She refused to say more than she could support. "The injuries are compatible with prolonged restraint, poor nutrition, and blunt trauma," she told Mason. "Compatible," Mason repeated. "That's the word. Can you connect those injuries to that kennel?" "No." "Deke?" "No." "Chain?" "No." Nell looked at him. "You want certainty. Find evidence. Don't make the dog carry a case he can't testify to." Mason wrote that sentence down. Deke was arrested on charges connected to stolen property and evidence recovered from the warehouse. He denied hurting Bramble. He denied knowing where Arden's notebook had been. He denied almost everything else. Then Lucian's attorney issued a statement. Deke Moreland, it said, had operated outside company policy. Any theft, improper handling of property, or misconduct involving animals had occurred without the knowledge or authorization of Lucian Frost. Mason read the statement aloud to Thayer 2 days later. Thayer set down the clock gear he had been cleaning. "So Frost is giving him the whole fire." "Looks like it." "Deke know?" "He does now." The effect was not immediate. It took another 48 hours. Then Deke asked for an attorney. Then he asked for a deal. He could not erase what he had done, but he could describe the system, which estates Lucian selected, which valuable objects were removed before final family review, which catalog descriptions were altered, which shell companies received auction proceeds, which warehouse shipments were moved across state lines, and what happened after Arden started asking questions. Deke admitted holding Bramble, admitted taking the dog through Hollis more than once, admitted believing the puppy could follow Arden's scent to wherever the records were hidden. He claimed Lucian never told him to strike the dog. He also claimed Lucian knew Bramble was being held. Knew why. Kept paying Deke. Kept asking whether the notebook had been found. The distinction sounded very important to Lucian's attorney. It sounded less important to everyone else. When investigators questioned Lucian, he maintained the same careful line. "I never instructed Mr. Moreland to harm that animal." Mason later repeated it to Thayer. Thayer stared through the workshop window where Bramble was lying in a strip of winter sunlight. He hired a man to do things he didn't want to see. Mason closed his notebook. "That isn't a legal definition." "No." Thayer looked back at him. "But it's an accurate one." The investigation expanded. Fraud, theft, interstate sale of stolen property, conspiracy. Evidence connected to Arden's assault remained more complicated, especially regarding the unidentified second man, but Frost Estate's clean public image began collapsing under its own records. Not because of one notebook, not because of one dog, not because Thayer had outsmarted Lucian in a dramatic confrontation. The business fell apart because too many small lies had been required to keep it standing. And small lies left paperwork. Weeks later, Wren Hollow held a quiet restitution gathering in the community hall. No reporters were invited inside. Some objects remained evidence. Others had completed the legal process and could finally be returned. Clarence Mott's son came for the brass Hollis badge. He was 70 himself. He held the badge in his palm and laughed once. "My father hated this job." Audrey looked surprised. The man smiled. "Complained about it every morning for 30 years. Then his eyes filled. Still kept that badge in his dresser. A woman from Burlington came for Eleanor Pike's silver brooch. She brought an old wedding photograph. In it, the brooch rested at Eleanor's collar. The woman pressed the recovered piece against the photograph but did not put it on. "It smells like metal polish," she whispered, as though that mattered. Maybe it did. The old chapel received its seal in a small padded box. The pastor held it with both hands. June stood near the refreshment table pretending not to cry while slicing a pie far more aggressively than pastry required. Thayer stayed near the rear wall. Bramble was not there. This room belonged to people and the things that had found their way back to them. Thayer watched hands close around objects. Not collectors' hands, not appraisers' hands. Hands that remembered. That was different. For decades he had told himself he collected discarded things because he respected craftsmanship, because old mechanisms were better, because repairing was satisfying. All true, none complete. He thought of Everett's broken pocket watch resting inside his jacket. He had never repaired that one, perhaps because somewhere inside himself he had always known the watch was not important because it was old. It was important because Everett had touched it, because it had lived in Everett's pocket, because losing the man had changed the meaning of the object forever. Thayer put one hand over the watch. Across the hall, Clarence Mott's son closed his fingers around the brass badge. Thayer finally understood why abandoned objects bothered him so much. He could not stand the idea that something once loved might disappear so completely that nobody remained to say where it belonged. That evening he went home before dark. Bramble met him at the door carrying one of Thayer's old gloves. Thayer looked down. "You stole that." Bramble wagged once. Thayer took the glove, then gave it back. "Fine." Bramble carried it toward the stove. Thayer watched him go. Some things could be bought. Some things could be stolen. Some things could even be hidden long enough for the world to forget them. But belonging was something else entirely. Arden Quill came back to Wren Hollow on a morning so bright the snow seemed almost blue. Mason did not tell Thayer the exact hour. That had been intentional. Thayer did not prepare Bramble either. No bath, no special collar, no rehearsed walk to the driveway. Some reunions, he thought, should be allowed to happen before people started arranging them. The old green pickup was parked beside the workshop. Thayer stood at his kitchen counter repairing the clasp on a brass watch case while Bramble lay near the front door, half asleep in a patch of winter sunlight. A car rolled slowly onto the drive. Bramble opened his eyes. He did not rise immediately. The engine stopped. A door opened. Thayer set down his screwdriver. Through the glass he saw Arden. The man in the video call had already looked worn by injury. In person, the damage seemed less dramatic and somehow more real. Arden was thinner than before. His silver hair had grown untidily over his ears, and round spectacles hung from a leather cord against a rust-brown chore coat. He leaned slightly on a cane as he stepped away from the car, protecting his right hip without quite admitting he needed to. Then Bramble saw him. The dog stood so quickly his hind feet slipped on the wooden floor. But he did not bark. He did not run. He became completely still. Thayer watched the muscles along Bramble's shoulders tighten. The right front paw lifted. For several seconds the dog seemed caught between memory and disbelief. Arden reached the bottom of the porch steps. He stopped too. His eyes filled before he spoke. "Bramble." The dog's ears moved. Arden said the name again. Not louder, just closer. Bramble took one step, then another. Thayer opened the door. Cold rushed into the house. Bramble crossed the porch carefully at first. Then whatever had been holding him together gave way. He moved into Arden with his whole body, not jumping, not circling wildly, pressing, shoulder against chest, head under Arden's arm, weight leaning so hard into the older man that Arden nearly lost balance. He dropped the cane, then lowered himself into the snow despite the pain in his hip and wrapped both arms around the dog. No one spoke. Bramble made a sound Thayer had never heard before, very low, almost a cry, though not quite. Arden buried his face in the fur along Bramble's neck. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Again, "I'm sorry." Thayer stood in the doorway. He had spent weeks imagining this moment. In some versions, Arden did not return. Those had frightened him. In others, Arden returned and Bramble ran to him. Those frightened him differently. Now the real thing was happening, and Thayer discovered there was no clean emotion available. I was happy, genuinely. Arden had survived. Bramble had found the person he had been waiting for. And beneath that happiness was pain. Quiet, embarrassingly personal. Thayer had once told Nell that Bramble would go somewhere else when healthy. He had believed it when he said it. Now, watching Arden's hand tremble in the dog's fur, Thayer understood that somewhere else had acquired a face. Arden looked up. Their eyes met. "Thank you." Thayer nodded. It was safer than speaking. Arden remained in Wren Hollow for several weeks. He needed to finish statements, identify records, meet prosecutors, and decide what remained of the life he had left behind. During that time, something unexpected happened. Nothing became simple. Bramble loved Arden. There was no question. When Arden arrived at Thayer's house, Bramble met him at the door. He slept near Arden's chair during long afternoons while the older man sorted papers with Mason. He responded to small sounds in Arden's voice that Thayer had never heard before. A soft click of the tongue, a two-note whistle, a particular way Arden said easy when Bramble became excited. These belonged to another history. Thayer did not interfere with them. At first he made himself stay busy. There was always something in the workshop that required attention. A lamp socket, a clock spring, a bent hinge. One afternoon, Arden found him polishing rust from an old Stanley plane that had already been cleaned for 20 minutes. "You know," Arden said from the doorway, "eventually there won't be any metal left." Thayer looked at the plane, then at him. Persistent rust. Terrifying enemy. It was the first time the two men laughed together. After that, the awkwardness became easier. Not gone, just less sharp. Arden told stories about Hollis before the factory closed. Thayer told fewer stories, but enough. Bramble moved between them without appearing concerned by the human complication. That was perhaps the lesson neither man had expected. The dog did not behave as though love required choosing immediately. When Arden sat in the living room, Bramble lay near his feet. When Thayer walked toward the workshop, the dog's head came up. If Thayer stayed outside too long, Bramble went to find him. If Arden left for a medical appointment, Bramble watched the driveway until the car disappeared. Then he eventually returned to whatever Thayer was doing. The first time Arden saw that clearly, he said nothing. But Thayer saw him notice. A week later, Arden received confirmation of his move to Maine. His younger sister lived near Portland, only a few miles from the rehabilitation clinic that would continue treating his hip. The apartment was small, second floor, shared courtyard, no workshop, no open land. Arden folded the letter and placed it on Thayer's kitchen table. "Good place," Thayer said. "Yes." You sound disappointed. I'm 72. Apparently I imagined aging would involve fewer forms. Thayer smiled faintly. Arden looked toward Bramble, who was asleep near the stove. I can take him. Thayer did not answer. I want that clear, Arden continued. If I decide he comes with me, I can make it work. I know. But the question is whether I should. That night they sat on the porch after dinner. The temperature had dropped, but there was no wind. Moonlight rested across the snowfields beyond Thayer's property. Bramble lay between their chairs. Arden rubbed one thumb over the repaired hinge of his round spectacles. I used to think loyalty meant staying. Thayer looked out toward the trees. Arden continued. Staying with a person, staying in a place, staying what you were when someone first loved you. Bramble shifted in his sleep. Arden looked down at him. I think I was wrong. Thayer said nothing. Maybe loyalty also means knowing when not to drag someone backward. The sentence stayed between them. A truck passed far down the road. Bramble raised his head, listened, then lowered it again. Arden smiled. He doesn't wait for every car anymore. No, he did with me. Thayer turned toward him. Arden's smile had gone. That's how I know. Thayer understood before the question came. If he wants to stay here, Arden said, will you let him? Thayer looked down at Bramble. For a long time he had thought the dangerous part of caring was loss. Everett had taught him that. Or perhaps Thayer had learned the wrong lesson from Everett. He had believed distance was protection. If nobody needed him too much, he could not fail them. If he never promised to stay, leaving could not become betrayal. But Bramble had arrived nearly frozen inside his coat and quietly destroyed that logic one ordinary day at a time. Food bowls, short walks, a stolen glove, a dog sleeping closer than the night before. None of it had felt like a promise while it happened. Together, it had become one. Thayer reached down and rested his hand on Bramble's head. The dog opened one amber-brown eye. Thayer remembered Everett's unanswered calls. Tomorrow, tomorrow, tomorrow. He had spent enough of his life believing there would always be another day to say yes. Yes, he said. Arden nodded. Nothing dramatic followed. That made the word feel larger. The legal transfer was completed properly. Veterinary records were updated. Ownership documents changed. Arden did not give away Bramble as though the dog were one of the antiques they had spent months returning to people. Instead, two men acknowledged what had already become true. Arden remained part of Bramble's life. He sent packages from Maine, visited when his health allowed, sometimes called Thayer only to ask whether Bramble was still stealing gloves. The answer was usually yes. Bramble had not replaced one home with another. He had simply learned that belonging could grow. Epilogue. 1 year later. Most of Hollis Copper Works remained exactly what it had been. Closed. Weathered. Too large and too expensive for anyone to transform into something sentimental. But the small brick inspection building survived. A state preservation grant covered part of the work. Wren Hollow raised more. Calvin Roebuck organized volunteers to repair the roof and reinforce the windows. June Bellamy ran fundraisers involving enough pie to threaten public health. Audrey cataloged donated objects. Maribel taught families how to document heirlooms before estate sales. Arden mailed restoration notes from Maine in handwriting that became increasingly difficult to read and therefore, according to June, more historically significant. A simple sign hung over the entrance. Wren Hollow Restoration Workshop. Thayer worked there 3 days a week. He still repaired clocks, lamps, tools, boxes, things whose owners wanted them back rather than replaced. Bramble came with him. At nearly a year and a half old, he had grown into a large German shepherd with a wheat gold coat and uneven charcoal saddle. The crescent-shaped scar on his right shoulder remained visible if the light struck it correctly. After long runs, the left hind leg still showed the faintest hitch. Some things stayed, others did not. Bramble no longer hid food beneath blankets. He no longer flattened himself at ordinary metal sounds, though a chain dragged suddenly across concrete could still make his ears tighten. He no longer slept facing every doorway. One winter afternoon, Thayer looked up from a pocket watch and noticed Bramble asleep in the middle of the workshop floor. Not against a wall, not beneath a table. In the middle, forelegs loose, belly partly exposed, back toward the entrance, anyone could have opened the door behind him. Bramble did not care. Thayer watched for a while, then returned to the watch. On the workshop wall hung a small wooden sign. Not everything broken needs to become what it was. Thayer had resisted putting it there. June had ignored him. For once he was glad. He understood the sentence now. A clock could be restored to its previous condition. People were different. Dogs, too. Everett would not return. Arden would never have the same body he had before the night at Hollis. Bramble would always carry a scar, and perhaps certain sounds would always reach deeper into him than others. Thayer would never become the young man who believed strength meant saving everyone. None of that meant they had failed to heal. Perhaps healing had never meant going backward. Perhaps it meant carrying what remained without letting it decide every road ahead. The following morning, Thayer opened the passenger door of his old green pickup. Bramble jumped inside. He was carrying a weathered leather glove in his mouth. Thayer stared at it. "No." Bramble held still. "We cannot bring every piece of junk in Vermont home." The dog tilted his head. Thayer pointed toward the yard. "Put it back." Bramble did not move. A long silence followed. Thayer sighed. "One." Bramble climbed onto the seat. "One piece of junk." The truck rolled out of the driveway beneath a clean winter sky. Wren Hollow shone ahead. An old man who once built his life around never being needed too much. A dog who once measured every doorway by whether someone might return through it. Neither of them was waiting now. They had somewhere to go. Sometimes peace does not come from getting back what we lost. It comes from learning that love can survive change. Thayer could not bring Everett back. Arden could not return to the life he had before that winter. Bramble could not forget everything that happened inside Hollis Copper Works. But none of them had to become who they once were in order to have a life worth living. Maybe that is true for us too. Some losses leave marks that never completely disappear. Yet with time, grace, and the right people beside us, those marks do not have to become the whole story. If this story meant something to you, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you would like to hear more stories about loyalty, second chances, and the quiet ways lives can find their way home, consider subscribing. May God give you peace for what cannot be changed, courage for what still can, and good company for the road ahead.